Hey everybody, welcome back. This is your host and creator of Historians of the Movies, Jason Herbert, and I've got a special pod for you today. I've got Patrick Wyman today. He came on board to talk about a film, The Last Duel, starring Adam Driver and Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Jodie Comer, amongst others. And if you're into the Middle Ages and you're into a real heavy history pod, today's your day because the events of this film actually happened. Patrick is intimately familiar with them. He is a scholar of the Middle Ages. He wrote a book called The Verge, which covers the Middle Ages. He's got a podcast called The Tides of History and a second podcast called The Pursuit of Dadl. He is an incredibly astute guy, knows all this stuff, and we have the best conversation for you today. So I'm going to keep this introduction short because I want you to hear this pod. So sit back and relax because The Last Duel is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Patrick Wyman, how are you, man?
Dude, I'm doing great. I'm so stoked to be here. I love movies about history. I love talking about movies about history. I love the particular movie that we're going to talk about. I'm fucking stoked. Let's roll.
For those of you who are coming from an evangelical background, now it's time to turn around for this podcast because if it didn't stop with the F-bombs, it's going to be stabbing through the face portions of the film that we'll get into a little bit later on, but
it is a film that is heavy on face stabbing, like even more so than most Ridley Scott movies. Like this is a big one for the face stabbing crowd.
You know, coming from a Southern Baptist church, I feel like as a child, I feel like face stabbing would be a thing folks would be used to in Kentucky. You know, if not the backstabbing, you know, we could definitely go for the face stabbing. But the Ridley Scott stuff. I definitely want to talk about Ridley Scott maybe versus Tony Scott because I have also thoughts on that because I've been watching a shit ton of Tony Scott stuff all over again as well. And it's weird because you know the difference between the two directors the second you start watching them, right? But one is fueled by cocaine.
I mean, it's often safe to assume for movies made in a particular age, and still some movies now, that cocaine was an operative part of the decision-making process.
Also, Scorsese's very open about the fact that he was on blow, like the entire Mean Streets.
You can tell. When you can tell. There's that's true of all Hollywood movies of a particular age. You can just see at what stages of the production process cocaine was involved. So sometimes it's the script writing, sometimes it's the decisions that were made about casting. Often the actors on set pretty clearly out of their minds on cocaine. So, but it's never the same. It's never like a constant amount of cocaine throughout every single stage of the process. Like there's the 80s movies are in large part defined by who was doing how much coke when.
Wouldn't books be better? Like historical monographs would be better if we knew when the scholar was doing blow.
Wouldn't history as a whole be more interesting if we could do like a toxicology report and see just how fucked up people were on what exact substances at any given time?
Yeah, I want to see Fernand Braudel talk about the longue durée and just do it really, really fast.
Yeah, I'm down for that. I think like that's one of my favorite things about kind of our recent turns in history is like realizing that people really have been just on stuff all the time. That like we as a species absolutely love to mess with our brain chemistry, and that is a constituent part of how we have organized societies and made decisions. And like chances are good if you're talking about a key political figure making a decision at some point in time, like probably suffering from some virulent venereal disease. Number one. Number two, also zonked out of his or her gourd on something like that. That's part of history. That's part of the human experience, man.
Yeah, JFK has now entered the podcast at this point in time. So you talk about a dude who was like hopped up on God knows what because his back was so effed up, and hop in the sack with like every single person,
Yeah, pretty undiscriminating when it came to exactly what he was doing. Like I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine recently, and he described JFK as the kind of guy who probably would have had sex with a bush if that was the only thing that was available. Like he's like, it's here. Like
the historical term for him is legend.
the man got around, as they say.
He did. And I actually just had Alexis Coe on the pod a few weeks ago, and she did Dave, right?
Love
she
that.
was talking. We ended up talking about like JFK's sex life because why not? We've got we've got degrees, right? So let's absolutely do it. So but returning back from that for a second, why don't you introduce yourself and like tell us who you are and like what are you doing here?
Yeah, so I am Patrick Wyman. I make a podcast called Tides of History that I have been making for about the last 6 years. I've covered a whole bunch of different stuff. I've covered the fall of the Roman Empire. I've covered the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. I just finished a long series on prehistory, and now I'm doing the Iron Age. So I'm doing the first millennium BC. I also do lots of interviews with scholars in all sorts of different fields. And let's see, what else do I do? Oh, I wrote a book called The Verge about the world around 1500. I'm writing another book right now called Lost Worlds about the long stretch from the end of the Ice Age to the end of the Bronze Age, which is it's really whooping my ass right now. I'm working on it, but it is.
Is it stabbing you in the face?
I would say it's more of a blunt force trauma. If I had to, I feel like like the meat hammers you use to make chicken cutlets.
Oh yeah.
Into tendies. Yeah, that's how I feel regularly. Is like I'm on the receiving end of a meat hammer from this one.
Yeah, and you launched a second podcast too. You have not one but two mistresses of pods. Right?
I have another podcast. It's called The Pursuit of Dadliness, in which I just talk about dad shit with people who are interesting. So I've talked about painting Warhammer 40K miniatures. A lot of talk about working out, which is basically the only hobby I have left at this point. How to parent small children, how to effectively steal your kids' Halloween candy is one that I'm very interested in.
Taxes,
since
baby.
We are recording on Halloween. Yeah, look, like not a lot of material benefits to parenting small children. So when you get the chance to steal their Halloween candy, you really got to take it.
I know. Actually, because of my size, I'm about 6'2", 250. I can actually take the candy from older children and full-grown adults at this point. I'm told that's called assault, but
it's Halloween. We make exceptions for these things, and frankly, those older children don't need the candy anyway.
No,
like they are gaming the system, and I for one won't stand for it.
No,
so I fully support your taking candy from older children. Project here.
Yeah. All right. Before we launch into this episode, like I'm going to need to get, usually we do this Coke versus Pepsi thing, and I see you're already rocking. Is that a Diet Pepsi? What are you doing?
That is it. We got a Pepsi Zero Sugar over here.
All right.
They were on sale. Oh, and you got a Coke. Okay.
Oh, I'm doing the real thing. I'm doing fully leaded.
God, that's wow. Okay. That sounds like it would taste so good. I don't think I've had a real Coca-Cola in probably 15 years.
Oh.
They were my go-to when I lived in Ireland. I was doing my master's degree. I would wake up just hungover as sin, reeking of cigarettes. After having had 15 beers the night before, and I would always go and I would get an entire thing of Doritos and the biggest straight up Coca-Cola they had. So I love them, but it also tastes like hangover to me, and so I don't know quite how to square that at this point.
I also find that at the age of 46, my metabolism has just slowed. So if I have a Coke, I jiggle my happy ass out the door later on. Like the only way I'm doing this is because I've got chest day later on today because I'm a day off my schedule. For those of you listening, chest day is only for Mondays. But
yeah, it's International Chest Day.
International Chest Day. But I know I can throw around a little bit later on, so I can handle the sugar, and probably I'll need it anyway. So that, and like whenever I record at night, I'm usually drinking. People don't know this. I'm usually like drinking like a beer or a glass of wine or something like that because it's like it's nighttime. But it's what 11:20 where I'm at right now, so it's a bit early.
So I mean, but as we were discussing earlier, we got to jack our brain chemistry with something.
Oh yeah,
and sugar and caffeine. Nothing wrong with that.
Oh, can I tell you? I just went to Utah recently for the very first time. Right, lots of great folks. I saw Salt Lake City, which I really dug, and then I went down to Provo for a conference. And of course, I go to Provo. There's nothing to drink and all this kind of stuff. And I'm talking to some folks, and I'm noticing there are ice cream stores and chocolate stores everywhere.
Yep.
And I was talking, and my friend who's practicing Mormon, she's like, sugar is our thing. Oh, okay,
yeah.
Cool.
I mean, I wonder if that explains why dentistry is such a Mormon coded profession. Like why so many of the dental franchises that are spread out all over the Western United States are they're like colonies of Mormon dentists who've set up shop, and they just kind of continue to move on and set up franchises. Like that was a big thing in my hometown. I grew up in Yakima, which is in the very middle of Washington State. And which is like not in what you would call like the extended LDS world, but like on its fringes kind of. But like when there would be like new Mormons moving to Yakima, they were often dentists who were setting up big dental offices. And I guess that's a thing. So I wonder, I mean, I'm fascinated by this sociologically, and I wonder what it has to do with the prevalence of sugar.
I don't know, but like, I know that like Kentucky where I'm from has really good dental schools, in like the University of Kentucky and University of Louisville. And I was like, really? My people? We have dental schools? Really? I'm easy, and I say this. I make fun of my people. I like because they're toothless, but I literally have a fake tooth. Like, and it's like I am also one of those.
Look, it's self-awareness of where we stand in these things is important. Like I chipped a tooth when I was 25 by wrestling with no mouth guard in. I was just raw dogging a training session and learned my lesson right there. Like, nope, just there went that. like a fragment, like fishing a fragment of tooth out of your mouth is exactly as disorienting as it sounds.
By the way, you just brought up a really important phrase that I think we need to bring into the historical profession, which is raw dogging. And I feel like would that be, if we were raw dogging history, would that just be not doing historiography, just letting it rip? Is that, it's like, what are you doing?
Yeah, it's like I'm sure you've seen the memes of like the modern historian digging through the archives to try to say one small thing, and the ancient historian who's like, this was told to me in a dream, so I'm writing it down. Like that's raw dogging history. Is if you got it in a dream and you made up the famous person's speech to write down in your text, that is raw dogging history.
I sure hope that comes up in your next book. Like,
I think that might be more of a podcast topic than a book topic.
Well, maybe the philosophers like Epictetus and the Stoics were like raw dogging history. People for the six of you left listening at this point in time.
We've really gone hard in a very specific direction, and I apologize if I have destroyed your listenership. On that basis.
We're fuck it. We're just raw dogging podcasts now. So
oh Jesus God. Oh,
I've worked so hard to build this community over 5 years, and in the course of 13 minutes and 17 seconds, we have just utterly destroyed all of the goodwill. So
I offer you my most sincere apologies for that. I take personal responsibility. If there's any way that I can make this up to you, please let me know.
Oh, okay, fair enough. You can switch back to Coca-Cola. The Pepsi I find is offensive, but
that's really the spot where I've lost you here.
I can get away with a lot of stuff, but okay. So it's an important question. All right, let's talk about this movie, The Last Duel, Ridley Scott's film. I talked to you. I was like, hey, let's do a movie, and there's no shortage of films in your area and stuff like that we could have chosen. And you were like, let's do The Last Duel. Why'd you choose The Last Duel?
I chose it because I think it's a deeply flawed movie in a lot of ways. As most of Ridley Scott's movies are. Like, I think every Ridley Scott movie has some sort of fatal flaw in it. But I think what sets the last... Are you talking shit
about Alien already?
Okay, not Alien. Alien is a fucking perfect movie.
It's a perfect film.
Absolutely perfect movie. But all of Ridley Scott's like historical films, all of his historical epics have some fatal flaw. I don't think that the fatal flaw in this one is in the history. I think that this is, of all of Ridley Scott's historical epics, this is the one that actually belongs to the period in which it's set. And I think critics understood that as making it feel stilted or kind of strange. And I actually think that that is really true to the spirit of the age in which it's set. I think it really channels that period of time. It feels like a weird and alien world, kind of like it's recognizably. It's recognizable. It's not like it's not like dropping us in head first and like playing on the alienness, but it's clear that the characters are working with different assumptions about how the world is supposed to work and their place in the world. And that to me is the essence of what makes not a good period drama, but an actual good movie about history, where you are learning something about the period in which the film is set that not like, because when it comes to movies about history, and I'm sure you have a far more like fleshed out thought processes on this than I do, but I don't really care if it gets the events right. Like I'm not concerned about whether, you know, like watching Braveheart, like you've got the Battle of Stirling Bridge without a bridge. Like I'm not going to bitch about that. No. Like that's it's whatever. It's a movie. Like that's fine. What matters to me is whether it is reflecting the values and thought processes of the age in which it's set. By that standard, Gladiator is a complete fucking failure, right? Like it has nothing to do with what people were thinking in the 2nd century AD or the reflections of the Roman world. Kingdom of Heaven may be a little bit better if we're sticking with Ridley Scott movies, but still very much not. Braveheart, it's a costume drama, right? Mm-hmm. Like the ways that the characters are thinking and acting have nothing to do with the 13th, 14th century. That is not true of this movie. Like when characters do things in The Last Duel, they are doing things that people in the 14th century would have thought made sense. And to me, that's a really special thing to have in a movie, whatever its other flaws are. I think it really captures that particular aspect of life.
The other cool thing about this film that I really dug as a historian is the narrative device, right? We see this film framed from 3 different perspectives, and I love this attempt, right? It's rarely ever done in film. It's ultimately maybe even a micro history when we think about what this is. But if we consider that every single person, like in a movie, is the star of their own film from their own perspective, and we usually only see 1, maybe 2 sides of a story, here we get 3 different sides of the story, and it's really cool. And I kept thinking about, Natalie Zemon Davis just passed just recently. Mm-hmm. I kept thinking about the return of Martin Guerre for some reason as I was watching this as well. From a historian's craft, I think it's really cool because you can talk about this and go, look, every single event has different observers, different perspectives, and we see that here.
It's so cool. It's hard to pull off as a filmmaker. I think like it's a lot easier to just tell a very straightforward story, right? It's much harder to not just to use the device of having multiple perspectives, but to have those different perspectives say something thematically about the material. Like there's doing any sort of, whether it's a novel or a movie or even a podcast, if you're writing a script for it, where the structure mirrors the themes that you're trying to get across, is very difficult to meld those 2 things together to the point where structure is theme and theme is structure is really, really hard to do. And I can see why people who watched this movie, whether they were lay people or even some critics, did not like that. Like it didn't do it for them. For me as a historian watching this and somebody who really loves the 14th and 15th century and is fascinated by those periods of time, it absolutely got me. I just thought it was pretty close to being perfect. And including, like, I know people talk shit about Matt Damon's mullet. Guess what? 14th century knights, they had mullets.
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. They're like, I would have liked to see him be a little bit more balding, because I think the skullet is an underappreciated historical look. Like a lot of balding dudes with long hair in the back.
Well, I got news for you, pal. It's happening over here, but go on.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. No, this is not a dude. Please don't take this as a critique of the skullet as a hair format. I want to be very clear on that. No, it's like all of these little details and things that I think people thought were kind of ridiculous or overblown, I think they actually work if you take the frame of the movie for being an attempt to faithfully represent some aspects of life in the 14th century through the lens of a story that also resonates with modern people. Like, I think it is as about as good a balance of those two things as you're going to see in a 2.5 hour movie. That I really liked it. I can understand why people hated it or just didn't like it or just didn't do it for them, but it really does do it for me. I really like this movie.
Yeah, so I want to get into this film because, so much with, historians of movies and HATM that we've done, we've really kind of played around with the idea of like, what is a history film, right? Mm-hmm. But this is very much a film rooted in history. Like, this actually happened, right? So for people who are maybe coming to this pod who actually haven't seen this film before or kind of like have seen this before, can you kind of set the stage about what's going on in this film and what really happened in life?
Yeah, so this film is based on a really famous incident that happens in 1386. It is one of the last judicial duels that takes place in the Kingdom of France. So a judicial duel is when basically you've got some sort of legal dispute between two parties, and the idea is, well, we're going to leave it in God's hands. The two parties are going to fight, and whoever wins, well, God must have chosen that person to win. So it's a pretty fitting expression of the medieval worldview in terms of faith and the importance of might. I would say you're probably going to get something essential about at least one part of the medieval world out of that. But so in this particular case, and this is where it resonates with a modern audience, the inciting incident is the reported rape of a French noblewoman named Marguerite de Carouge at the hands. She accuses a guy named Jacques Legris of having raped her. So her husband, Jean de Carouge, goes and accuses Jacques Legris of this. He goes to the king. He says, I want to have a judicial duel. And the king, who is a pretty oddball character and would go on to have a very tragic and not great later life for this particular French king, was intrigued by it. And he's like, okay, we're going to go ahead. We're going to do it. So they fight this duel. There are a bunch of different accounts of the events in question that survived. This was a really, it was as close to kind of a celebrity event as you're going to get in the late 14th century. So there's a lot of source material about it. A lot of the most famous writers of the day had things to say about it. It shows up in Froissart's Chronicle, which is one of our main narrative sources for this period. It's a really well-known, impactful event. In the end, Jean de Carouge comes out on top. He kills Jacques Legris. Jean de Carouge is rewarded for this. He becomes quite politically influential, and he's got a lot of money. And he and his wife kind of ride off into the sunset here after this horrible series of events. I have more on Jean de Carouge and his afterlife, which I think really sums up a lot about chivalry and medieval knights that we can go into. But it's a story that people at the time thought was fascinating and meaningful. It was something that really resonated with them, not just because in the context of the late 14th century, it was salacious. The idea of one nobleman sexually assaulting another nobleman's wife gets into all of these really complicated ideas about property and ownership and honor. It touches on things like chivalry and courtly love and how a knight is supposed to behave. Also on the day-to-day mechanics of how nobles interacted and disputed with one another over things like land. So there are all of these long-standing feuds between nobles about this particular patch of land that they really liked for some reason and were mad about. And that's one of the roots of this particular dispute, is that Legris and Jean de Carouge were going back and forth about this one specific piece of land. So this is, it's an extremely medieval story. It's a story in which the conflict itself grows naturally out of the late medieval world, out of its dynamics. And it's also one in which the way those conflicts were expressed and resolved is entirely medieval, right? So I can understand, like I said, again, why there are modern audiences to whom this doesn't appeal, or it seems strange, or like critics who are like, well, couldn't we have done this, or this? Like, yeah, you could have, but then it wouldn't have been medieval. Then it wouldn't have been an actual reflection of the things that were happening here. So it was a really controversial series of incidents. It was controversial at the time. It was controversial in its afterlife. The modern accounts of the events are controversial. It was not actually the last judicial duel. There were at least a couple of other instances after this in which these things happened, but it was the one that people thought was meaningful enough to slap that label on it. Which says a lot about how it was remembered. And memory, history and memory are two very different things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We just saw we just saw the new Speaker of the House here in the United States talk about how we need to go back to 18th century values, and the historians and us all just go, wow.
Especially considering the rates of out of wedlock births in the first couple of decades of the American Republic were like exceptionally high by any historical demographic standard. Everybody was drinking a pint of fucking whiskey a day. Well,
we talked about cocaine earlier, man. Fucking nostalgia is a hell of a drug. I mean, that's really where
none greater, man. None greater.
And that's really, and I think that's one of the interesting things about this film, because so many, when we get into like medieval films or medieval stories, so much of it's actually maybe rooted more in nostalgia or imagined memory versus this, which is trying to hew close to the bone on this. And like you're just talking about, what we see here is the cool part of this is these real interpersonal relationships. So much of this is based on stature, what a man can do or a woman can do based upon where they rank in that society. So I thought maybe it might be kind of cool. We've seen these positions in other films before. People who've come to us have seen Sword in the Stone or A Knight's Tale or anything like that. But maybe we could talk a little bit about what you get to do or who you are at certain stages and things like that, and kind of break down, if you will. We're introduced to these guys, Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris. It's my Cajun French coming out. Introduce some crawfish and a French cooking later on. But what's a squire compared to, say, a knight or a nobleman versus, say, a king or anything like that? So, can you lay out basically who these guys are and what they can do?
Yeah, so there's a really complex gradation of social rank that we see in medieval societies, even when you get into the elite. So it's not just that there are nobles and common people, nobles and peasants, nobles and serfs. There are really complex status gradations within the elite group. Now, we think of knights as being, guys who fight on horseback. Knight is a very specific social rank. Right. So it comes with privileges that are attendant. It comes with being able to do and say particular things. You're usually going to have a particular level of income or level of landed wealth that goes along with that. That is distinct from the professional job of being a man at arms, which is to be a guy who fights in armor, usually on horseback. Right. So you can be a squire in terms of your social rank below a knight, while still being a full-blown dude who carries a lance and rides into people at full speed on horseback. Those are distinct things. There were lots of poor men-at-arms or men-at-arms who did not come from a high social background. Knights are something very different. So you could have the social rank of a knight and not be particularly oriented around fighting as your profession. You usually were. There's quite a lot of overlap. Medieval nobility in general is a quite militarized social stratum, but we have to see those things as being distinct, right? So one of the tensions in this movie is that Jacques Legris is climbing the social ranks. He is a newcomer. He is not. He doesn't have the kind of illustrious background that Jean de Carouge does. And so, from de Carouge's perspective, as Legris is rising, there's something inherently suspect about rising above one's position in general. And to do so on the basis of what seems pretty clear in the surviving source material, some combination of talent and great social connections. Legris wasn't an idiot. He was somebody who powerful, important people thought was useful to them. Which is one of the underlying social tensions of this period. Is you have people who are rising in a fairly chaotic age where there's a ton of warfare. There's a ton of nobles who are being killed or who are losing their lands because they're picking the wrong side in these disputes. The 100 Years' War is framed as being England versus France. And to some extent that's true, but it's the English crown versus the French crown. And that's not the same thing as modern nation states. So the individual nobles will have social ties, marriage ties, cultural ties, professional ties to different nobles who may align themselves in different ways with different crowns at different points in time. Like, so it's this very complex kind of social tapestry that's based around these individual connections, and these very individual places in a shared social hierarchy. So England and France, you can be a French noble and go serve at the English court, and you're not like violating some nationalistic principle. If anything, you might be violating an oath to a king, which is a big deal, but that's not the same thing as like having a tie to a nation that exists outside the person of the king who rules it. It's a very different conception of how loyalty works, and of how the world works. And this movie reflects that. Like, the ties that you see are, it's not when Jean de Carouge is going to battle, he's not saying for France, he's saying for the king, because that's who his oath is to, right? So that's like Jacques Legree's ties aren't to some kind of abstract, duchy or county or even to a kingdom. It's to his patron, right? Like, these are things that are of the specific time and place that belong there.
So we've got these two dudes here, and then sitting at the center of the story is Marguerite de Carouge, right? And we see obviously the purported sexual assault onto her, which sits at the very center of all of this. What is the relationship between men and women at different class structures, say in France in 1386?
So it depends a great deal on your social status, right? So to be a peasant woman is a much different thing than to be a noble woman. There are different demographic patterns that are attendant on those things. If you're a noble woman, you're much more likely to marry earlier in life. You're much more likely to marry a man who's quite a bit older. Those kinds of demographic patterns are more marked in England than they are in France, but there's still a divide there. Like, to be a member of the nobility means that you're entering a different world of gender relations. Like, there are commonalities that go up and down the social spectrum in terms of how people are thinking about the relationship between men and women, right? But we're not getting a medieval version of gender norms and relations. We're getting a very specific medieval noble version. And that's a much different thing. And so one of the kind of underlying threads in this story, which I find delightful, is Jacques Legree is very into courtly romance. Like, and the idea of courtly romance and reading these texts, he talks about himself. He's a reader. He's got preferences as to which romances he likes. That's something he talks about at this festival with Marguerite de Carouge that kind of gets him into her in the first place, convinces him that he has to have her. But there's this set of expectations that go along with ideals of courtly love and this way that the different parties are seeing themselves. And you can see Jacques Legree is seeing himself as the hero in a story of courtly love, right? That's the way that he's presenting himself and the way that he's considering himself. And the reality is he's just a rapist.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he's just the way that he's thinking about himself and the story that he's telling himself about who he is rooted in, real stories that people were telling at the time and reading, and that were impacted the way that people understood these gender norms among nobles. But he is just a rapist, right? Like, so there's a fascinating tension there. And there's a tension in the way that, Marguerite de Carouge understands what a noble knight is supposed to be, and the way in which her husband doesn't live up to that. Right, because he's a fucking moron, which we can talk about more. I would love to talk about Matt Damon being a moron in this movie, doing a real convincing performance as a moron. Clearly he is not what she thinks a valiant knight is supposed to be. Jacques Legree is not the courtly lover come to call that he acts like he's supposed to be, and she's not a damsel, right? Like, she, despite everybody's attempts to cast her as somebody without agency in this movie, she is working through the structures that are available to her to exercise her agency and to get what she thinks is justice for the wrong that was very clearly done to her, right? So there's a ton of gray in here, not just in the color palette that it's shot in. There's a ton of gray in that too, but there's a ton of ethical gray, moral gray, and cultural gray that is where I think this movie really shines. I think that's what makes it really interesting and worth watching. But again, I can also see how people wouldn't like that about it.
Can you speak to the idea, before we get into Matt Damon's stupidity in this film, can we speak to a little bit about the idea of what chivalry is versus what we conceptualize it to be in 2023? Because I remember when I was on dating sites back in Florida years ago, I would see women say, I'm looking for a man who still believes in chivalry, which I understood as I need to have a boat.
Yeah. Okay. So chivalry is really interesting, and it is as a concept among historians of the Middle Ages. It has been really reevaluated, especially over the last couple of decades, but really over the last 40 or so years. And the current scholarly consensus on it, and I think this is exactly accurate if you're reading through the actual texts from the time, the core of chivalry is not protection of the innocent or the weak or being nice to women. It's that you are a person who is allowed to do violence, and you are expected to be good at doing violence, and that kind of violent action is at the core of your identity and your being. That is what chivalry is. It is your prowess. It is your ability to fight well. And all of that other stuff it's not that it's not present, but it's very much secondary to that core identity. So as you go along and you get into the 14th century and into the 15th century, sure, there's stuff in there about, romance and behaving the right way with women. But there's also nothing that says you're not a proper knight if you burn down a village and rape a peasant woman. That's entirely, there's absolutely no contradiction or contrast or violation of an ideal of chivalry if you do that. Like, there's, on the one hand, it's easy to think of knights as being kind of posturing and ridiculous figures. And Jean de Carouge, with his puffed up ego and his overwhelming sense of his own importance and just consistently doing really stupid things. Like, they're stupid militarily, they're stupid tactically, they're stupid in terms of, undermining his social position and his connections to his social betters, like really genuinely stupid shit. But that's also a reflection of the personality of a knight at this particular point in time. He thinks that because he is good at fighting, which he undoubtedly is, that is a consistent facet of his character as we see it, and as he's portrayed in the surviving source material. Everybody agrees Jean de Carouge is good at fighting. Like, that's a pretty perfect embodiment of what a knight's supposed to be. He's not wrong in seeing himself as an idealized knight for being good at that and for serving his king and for honoring his oaths. Like, he is 100% living up to the exact social expectation of what a knight is supposed to be, of what chivalry is supposed to be. Now, is there a clash between his attempt to live that out and the actual way in which medieval society is working? Absolutely. Because you can tell Pierre, who's the kind of played by Ben Affleck, he's kind of behind the scenes setting the terms under which all of this stuff is happening. That guy doesn't give a shit about whether Jean de Carouge is a perfect knight or not. He says he's no fun. He says he's an idiot and that he thinks very little of his character, all of which perfectly reasonable. If we're looking at it from his perspective, I don't think any of that would be wrong. But you can see, just because Jean de Carouge is living up to what he imagines, not without good reason, as being kind of the essence of what a knight is supposed to be, that can still clash with the society around him. So it's not like knights have everything all their own way all the time, or men at arms are somehow the most socially useful class. You can be the best fighter in medieval France and still be fucking broke. Right? Like, those are things that I like about this movie, as I think doing a pretty good job of reflecting the actual social dynamics at the time. Other things that this movie does really well, and that I think it really nails about chivalry and knights, is that these are acquisitive people. They think that they should be materially rewarded for fighting. That if you go out and you serve your king and you do a lot of face stabbing, then you should get lands for that. You should get lands, you should get money, you should be rewarded. You should be rewarded in terms of your social position. That to them is kind of the social contract that they're operating under. So there's no distinction in their minds between the performance of violence reinforcing and buttressing their social position and social advancement. So for Legree to be advancing by doing this kind of work for Pierre, by collecting taxes for him, administering his lands, all stuff that any rational person would be like, yeah, that you need administrators, right? Like if you're going to have any sort of functioning state structure. To Jean de Carouge, that's deeply suspicious and dishonorable. Right? Like that is not how you're supposed to advance. You're supposed to advance by sticking your sword in someone's face, and then you're supposed to get a chain around your neck that says you've done it. You've reached that point.
Sword face sticking champion, 1386.
Exactly. That's where you're supposed to be. So all of which is a roundabout way of saying I really like the way this movie portrays knighthood. I think it's pretty dang accurate. I think it doesn't get sidetracked. Like it acknowledges that there are these other aspects to knighthood that we tend to think are more important, that have taken on an outsized importance in our modern understandings of what chivalry was. It acknowledges that those existed. They did exist. Knights did read courtly romances, right? Like they did think of themselves as being, kind of these chivalrous heroes. That's not wrong. But that was always secondary to being able that if somebody talked shit to you who was of a lower social position, you were perfectly justified in splitting their head open. Those two things were not contradictory in the medieval knight's worldview.
We see the plague referenced throughout this film. 1386. What's going on with the plague, and is that relevant to our timeline in 2023 at all?
I don't know if it's relevant to our timeline in 2023, though. The remark about increasing labor costs at one point in this movie does resonate pretty well. So we are by 1386. We are well past the first outbreaks of the plague, which happened in the late 1340s and early 1350s. But we are now living in a world in which plague is endemic and not pandemic, right? So the plague is coming back at fairly regular intervals. So normally what happens demographically when you have a pandemic is the population will be struck really, really hard, but then it usually rebounds fairly quickly unless the disease etiology changes such that plague is now there all the time. So this is why the Justinianic plague of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages is so devastating. This is why the Black Death is so devastating. It's because they don't just come once and wipe out and hit the population hard. Is that they come back again and again and again and again and again. They come back every generation. They affect new age cohorts that don't have any immunity to them. It's not just that the plague kills a bunch of people, it's that it sets a new demographic baseline for Europe as a whole, right? It's that you're not going to get a next generation of laborers to suddenly drop labor costs back down. You are now in a permanent situation where there's less land under cultivation. Labor is much more expensive. You can't charge nearly as much for rents as you used to be able to because there just isn't as much demand for land. So this squeezes guys like Jean de Carouge who are really dependent on rents from their lands. It makes people like like Legree much more valuable for knowing how to squeeze and knowing how to get revenues out of all of this stuff. That's a fundamental economic and social change that comes along in the aftermath of the Black Death. There are arguments among scholars as to when we should date this, how severe this shift is. There a lot of that, but I think the baseline is pretty strong, is pretty solid. Like there is a changing. So guys like Jean de Carouge are going to feel a kind of an inherent threat to their social position because you can't just go out and get all the money from your peasants and then go off and fight anymore. Now I got to do this campaign. Now I got to do that because they're squeezed, and so you can see this with a lot of these minor nobles and knights in the 100 Years' War, where they're just constantly signing up for campaigns. There are really detailed, fantastic resource of enlistment records for the English armies in the 100 Years' War. And you can see the same names over and over and over again, where these guys are just going on campaign after campaign after campaign. Yeah, they're professional soldiers, but also they don't have any, they're not going to get paid to do anything else. It's the only skill set that they have. They've probably, this a man at arms. If you've got enough money to afford armor and a horse and weapons, like you've got a little bit of land, but it's not enough to support you. You need to get paid for fighting. You need to have a profession as a soldier, in addition to being, kind of landed knight who goes out when the king calls.
Yeah, we see this, right? We see Jean de Carouge, Matt Damon out saying, I'm broke. which
Mhm.
kind of goes against the perception I think we have is, in the 21st century of knights as wealthy and having
Mhm.
estates and manors. And this is a very working class kind of knighthood, is it not?
Yeah, it really is very much so. It is man at arms as a profession that is not even a particularly well paid one. Like you could get some really good windfalls as a man at arms, but there was a good chance you go on a campaign. Like there are usually, we don't see this in this movie, but there are contractual structures that go along with this. Like you're usually signing contracts, you're agreeing to be paid on a particular wage scale. That may be a lump sum, or it may be kind of per day, per month type of thing. There are variations on this depending on exactly where in Europe you're talking about in the 14th century. Like the contractual structure in Italy is much more advanced than it is in France. The English contractual structure for building armies is more sophisticated than the French one is, but these baseline expectations are still there. This is an evolving commercial environment, an evolving market for military labor, basically, if we want to put it in those terms. And Jean de Carouge, you can see, is like bewildered by having to be part of this marketplace for skills and violence. Like this is like, whereas, if you were to ask Legree, it would probably make perfect sense to him because he's a guy who understands money. He understands what you're paying for when you do these things. But Jean de Carouge is just fucking baffled by it, which strikes me as a really valuable little nugget.
We talked a little bit about the idea of pledging fealty to say the king, or pledging loyalty to even Pierre. We see the scenes where both Legree and de Carouge are pledging themselves to Ben Affleck. What's the role of the church, though, say in 1386? Or is the church are people having to pledge themselves to the church as well? Does the church have a power over people? What's going on in the holy lives of people?
Okay, so this is a complicated time to be asking those questions in the late 14th century, because there is a schism in the church. There are multiple popes, or multiple people claiming to be pope. One of them is in Avignon in southern France. There's another one in Rome. I think we may actually be nearing the period where there's a third pope. I can't remember the exact chronology, but there's the point is that the overall authority of the church has fractured. There is no kind of the power of what's called the papal monarchy, where the Pope is a powerful sovereign figure who is intervening in tangible ways in the politics and of European life. That period is kind of past. That's much more of a 13th century phenomenon than 12th and 13th century phenomenon that it is of the 14th century. In the 14th century, the institutional church is becoming much more closely tied to individual monarchies throughout Europe. So kings are kind of clawing back some of the privileges and powers that have been granted to the church, or that the church has taken over the past several centuries. So the idea of the church's presence in this movie being fairly marginal is not all that surprising to me. Like there's a lot of talk about God and faith and things of that nature, which I think is a pretty good way of thinking about it. Like this is an incredibly religious society by our standards, right? Like it's just like ideas about faith and sin and God's role in ordering the world are omnipresent in people's lives. But the church as an institution may not have been. Like there's a lot of peasants who may have seen a priest once a year. Like they're not, like there may be a parish in the village, there may be a church, but like may have gotten burned down the last time the English came through. Has anybody repaired it? We don't really know. We'll get around to it eventually. Until then, the priest's just going out. He's doing his thing. But the priest also has a wife and 4 children, and one of them is going to succeed to the is going to be the priest of this village after his father dies. Like there's a lot of that stuff going along. So we kind of have to alter our expectations of what the church did and who made it up. And like it's a really the way to think about the medieval church, in my opinion, is it's a really big tent. It includes a lot of different things because it's a universal church. So you've got impoverished monks who are scraping out a living. You've got cardinals who are wearing who are like as rich as any individual figure in Europe. You've got politically connected bishops. You've got holy ascetics. Like all of these people belong under the umbrella of the church, and uh, and that's not necessarily the same thing as understanding people's faith and the ways in which they thought of and consumed religion. This is a period where like personal prayer books, like books of hours, are becoming much more popular. So if you're a wealthy and literate noblewoman, you are very likely to have a whole collection of your own religious texts that are kind of guiding your own personal devotions. The 14th century is a period, and into the 15th century are periods where there's a lot of what we would call lay piety, a lot of interesting things happening in terms of the way that lay people, and especially noble women, are expressing their faith and thinking about the role of God in their lives and what they want their relationship with God to be. So it's a fascinating kind of tapestry of these things happening that all then intersect with the institutional aspects of the church and the way in which it's a presence in the economy and society and culture.
All right, we've set the stage now. We've talked about we've talked about chivalry. We've talked about knights, and we've talked about squires and the church. I want to talk about what you love about this film. And do you want to start with Matt Damon as a dumbass? Like,
yes.
Let's go.
Yes.
Let's go with
yes. Okay. So I love Jean de Carouge as a character because if I were writing a podcast script on this period, he would be a perfect kind of point of view character to understand the trends of the age, and also to understand the figure of knight as dumbass, which I think is a really important thing for us to grasp. Like a lot of these dudes were like, you have to imagine, like with all of the discussion these days about repetitive head trauma, like these dudes, a lot of them probably had like what we would think of as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Like these dudes have been getting hit over the head repeatedly since they were small children. Like the amount of concussive trauma that these guys had was immense. So I think we should probably be thinking in terms of brain damage as another one of those things that's going along with, like brain damage is a defining feature of medieval society. So I like that Matt Damon is just kind of portrayed as a dumbass from everybody's perspective but his own. Like if the second that you step outside the perspective of Jean de Carouge, you see that other people are like, what the fuck is this guy doing? Like he's such an idiot. But he has this view of himself as honorable, noble warrior who is fulfilling his obligations to God, he's fulfilling his oaths, he's fulfilling his obligation to his wife. Like he thinks that by fighting this duel, he is upholding his wife's honor, and that's the thing that matters, right? Like that's like he is behaving exactly as you would expect him to, and in the end, he wins, right? He's rewarded for this. He's not wrong in his understanding of how of the society in which he lives and how its incentives and reward structures work. My favorite part about Jean de Carouge is that he survives the duel. Not to spoil this for everybody. He's promoted. This pod, but yes. Jean de Carouge dies 10 years after this in the single dumbest crusade of the Middle Ages. Like if you were to have a crusade that sums up all the dumbest shit that medieval knights thought about warfare and did, it's called the Crusade of Nicopolis. So it's against the Ottomans. The Ottomans at this point have not taken Constantinople, but they are kind of the rising power in the Balkans and in southeastern Europe. They control much of Anatolia. They have built a professional army out of what would later become the Janissaries, or I think they are still Janissaries at this point. They wage war as both a business and a product of a developing state apparatus, right? So these are professional soldiers who fight together under the direction of experienced commanders. And this is what the Ottoman Empire is. This is why the Ottoman Empire is expanding. It is the most impressive of the growing states of the late Middle Ages. Like medieval historians talk a lot about the rise of the state. Right, like this is one of the kind of the core developments of the late Middle Ages as a historical period. The Ottoman, and normally when medieval historians talk about this, they're talking about what happens in England, what happens in France, maybe Burgundy as an example of kind of stunted state formation, why it then doesn't happen in the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, why it happens there more effectively and efficiently than anywhere else. But the Ottomans usually get left out of this discussion, even though they are very much part of the process of state formation that's happening in Europe. Like the Ottomans are a European power far more than they are a Near Eastern power. Like their most important interactions are with European powers. Their technological transfer, their institutional knowledge. A lot of this is happening in a kind of an Eastern Mediterranean space, right? It's not like they're not oriented toward Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Persian world. They're oriented toward Europe. So the Crusade of Nicopolis is when a whole bunch of French knights, dumbass Jean de Carouge among them, kind of march off to go fight the Ottomans. And they do so without having a real good sense for what the Ottomans are doing, for who the Ottomans are, for how they fight, for what they're good at. And they just kind of go and they charge into battle at a place called Nicopolis. They get absolutely crushed. Like they fight pretty well for a while, and that's the part that they harp on. Like when you ask them about it after the battle, they're like, "Well, we almost got him."
It's like the Falcons in the Super Bowl versus the Patriots. We're up 28-7.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly the kind of story that they tell about the Crusade of Nicopolis. It's like, well, we almost had them on the run, and then they just all lose, right? So a bunch of them get captured. Very few of the flower of chivalry, especially from France and Burgundy, are on this crusade. A lot of them die on the battlefield. Jean de Carouge seems to have died on the battlefield. In the midst, he got stuck in a gully, probably. The battlefield was kind of riven with dead ground, and at one point, Jean de Carouge, following his lord, seems to have ridden into this gully. I think that's where they found the body of Jean de Vienne, who is the guy that Carouge was with. Carouge probably dies there, but if he didn't die there, where he did die was that in the aftermath, they took a couple thousand prisoners, the Ottomans did, and then just cut all their heads off. They just executed all of them and piled up their heads. And they were like, and again, the flower of French chivalry, just ending their lives on a battlefield in Eastern Europe through a defeat that was almost entirely of their own making.
All right. I know the answer to this, but I want to get into it real fast. And this is a bit peripheral, but can we talk about why the Janissaries were such complete badasses and why they're interesting, almost for people who are not familiar with the Middle Ages or who tend to think of Middle Ages, like you're saying, in terms of England and France and other places, but not the Ottoman Empire. What's up with the Janissaries? You want to dive in on that one?
Yeah. So the Janissaries are fascinating because I think they represent this really. They're an incredibly Ottoman institution in the sense of what sets the Ottomans apart from the other states that were around them, and also Ottoman in the sense that they represent a blend of a whole bunch of different things, a whole bunch of different influences coming from different directions. So the idea of having slave soldiers, right, a caste of professional slave soldiers who are loyal to whoever the ruler is and the ruler alone, it has really deep roots in the Muslim world. And you can find examples of this institution all sorts of different places. Like the Mamluks in Egypt are the most famous example of this. I mean, and eventually they become the rulers of Mamluk Egypt. They have their own dynasty that lasts for a very long time. But it exists all over the place. It goes back to 9th, 10th century, the Abbasids in around Baghdad. Like they have Turkish slave soldiers that they import from the steppes. So, or Turkic, sorry. So the Janissaries are an example of this. They are usually Christian boys who are taken at a young age. They are converted to Islam. They are well trained. They are the kind of the personal army of the Sultan, which is not something that they're called beyliks in Anatolia have at this point. Like at the beginning, the Ottomans are just one of a whole bunch of competing little local dynasties. There are like dozens of them scattered throughout Anatolia. The Janissaries are one of the things that set the Ottomans apart. So they have a core of professional soldiers. They're trained to fight as infantry, which is different than most of the slave soldiery in the Muslim world are cavalry. The Janissaries are infantry. They're well drilled. They're well trained. They fight together. They are always trained to fight together. They are loyal only to the Sultan, so they don't have to. So they don't it's not like every generation the Sultan has to go out and make a whole new round of alliances to get soldiers. Suddenly there's an institutional part of the state. They're paid through regular taxation. So it's not just that you have the soldiers, it's that you have the structures to support them and make them a kind of a constant presence in the military force of the Ottoman world. So they are among the first of the standing professional armies that we see as kind of one of the hallmarks of state formation in the late Middle Ages. So they're exceptionally good at what they do. They're present at basically all of the major victories of the Ottoman Empire over the next couple of centuries. In terms of their equipment, they're really well armed. There are state armories that are put into that are supported by the state to provide them with equipment. They're among the earliest large scale adopters of gunpowder weaponry in the 15th century. They're right on the cutting edge of military technology as it develops in the 14th and the 15th century. They're not they're examples of this from elsewhere. If we move further to the West in Europe, they're not alone in having done that, but the effectiveness, the scale, and the institutional stability of the Janissaries really set them apart. And it's what sets apart the Ottoman Empire too. Like it's really a microcosm of why, out of this kind of ferment of different little miniature states that are all fighting and competing with one another, why the Ottomans are the ones who end up winning. You
talked about Jean de Carouge's death. By the way, Janissaries just sound like complete bad. Are they not the basis of the Unsullied on Game of Thrones?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what I kept thinking about that, right? All right. Jean de Carouge, complete dumbass, dies in battle. Hopefully for him, he dies in battle. It sounds like worse not dying in battle. What happens to the king?
Okay, so the king, 6 years after this, after the events of this movie, and Jean de Carouge is actually present for this event. The king, they're riding kind of with the army. They're going on campaign. I think it's near Le Mans, and the king has what we would think of as a psychotic break. So he pulls out his sword. He thinks there are English soldiers near, and he starts attacking his attendants. And then he rides off, and his all of his high nobles around him have to track him down and kind of calm him down. But by the time this is done, he's killed several people. Like, the king has murdered several of his squires and attendants. And after this point, the king never really rules again. So he, at this point, the politics of the Kingdom of France devolve into internecine struggles between the king's uncles, who are these highly accomplished, incredibly wealthy and powerful figures. And this is what sets up the factional politics of France to be so thoroughly taken advantage of by the English in the later stages of the 100 Years' War. So the victor, there's a reason why this king wasn't leading his army at the Battle of Agincourt, right, in 1415. This king eventually, he produces a daughter, and she marries Henry V of England. Their son, Henry VI, is supposed to inherit both kingdoms. And unfortunately, it also seems that Henry VI inherited his grandfather's mental illness, because he's known throughout his reign as he has like periods where he's completely catatonic. And a lot of the struggles of England that lead directly into the Wars of the Roses seem to have been a result of the mental illness that Henry VI inherited.
Oh, I got to ask you, because you're talking about this inherited. Was inbreeding as common in France and England at this point? Because I'm thinking about is it Charles, the Spanish king, who Carlos?
Yeah, the Habsburgs, who were notorious for it. I think by our standards, they're a little more inbred, but not to the point where I think you would expect to see kind of hereditary disorders of this kind. I think this was kind of an unfortunate thing. Like, at this point, there is enough new blood coming into the ranks of the high nobility that they're not like, it's not like everybody's marrying their first cousin, or marrying like close relations or uncles, like marrying an uncle, something that happens among the Trastámaras in Spain. Like, they are, even well before the Habsburgs are ruling Spain, the Trastámaras are incredibly inbred. Right. So it is happening in certain places. It's not so much here. I don't think that's the reason for it. I think it's just kind of an unfortunate quirk of history.
All right, so think Atlanta, not Arkansas, in terms.
Yes.
Of, very good. All right.
Nothing against the fine people of Arkansas.
Oh no, we have nothing against people in Arkansas. Indiana, on the other hand, what else do we like about this film? What are they doing well?
The fighting. I think the fighting is really good.
Fighting is hard to watch in this movie, even for me, and I like fighting movies.
Yeah, as it should be. I can tell you directly where they got the inspiration for the fight scenes from. And so medieval texts are not shy about describing violence.
Really?
Right? Like and a lot of the time, especially as we get into the later Middle Ages, these texts are being written by people who have firsthand experience of violence. And when you look at the human remains from mass graves of late medieval battles, there is no question about what warfare looked like, right? Like, so the most famous one of these is from the Battle of Towton, which takes place in 1461. It's one of the battles of the Wars of the Roses, supposed to have been the bloodiest battle of the Wars of the Roses. And you can see the way that these bones look is just horrifying. Right. I mean, there are heads split in half. There are massive holes from arrows. There are like places where a skull was probably repeatedly crushed by somebody just punching it. Like somebody who had lost their weapons and just punched the skull until it was completely gone. I mean, there's one very famous skull that usually shows up where there's just a sword cut all diagonally across the face. The whole face is split in two diagonally by a sword blow. And that's what medieval combat was. And so when we're talking about these guys, when we're talking about knights and their prowess and, using kind of euphemistic terms for it, that's what it was. It was that they were face to face with people. They were killing them with weapons and hand-to-hand fighting. And that was the nature of medieval combat. So if you read the more honest textual accounts of it, it talks about them rolling on the ground and hitting each other in the testicles and, smashing them with rocks and like all of these kind of desperate last ditch things. Like that was the nature of fighting. They were also highly trained and very good at it. Is the other aspect. It's not like they were just kind of clanging, like clanging steel off of their armor. Like these guys were well trained. There was a lot of technique to it. They were past, they were instructed by people who had spent their whole lives learning how to fight. So there's a really striking scene early in this movie when Matt Damon, he's knocked off his horse in a river and he reverses his sword and he uses the part of the blade closest to the hilt to cut a guy's throat. That's a technique. That's not something you just think to do one day. That's something that you are taught to do and you practice it over and over and over again. So when we talk about, knights as killers and purveyors of violence, it's not just that they were doing it because it appealed to them psychologically or because they were bullies. Like that, it was their job. They practiced it all the time. They were really good at it by any reasonable standard. And so we should expect, if we're watching medieval fight scenes as we are in this movie, for them to be competent. Like they're not just like banging off each other. They're vicious. They're the life or death struggles with any weapons that are at hand. And you like every knight at some point falls off his horse, winds up on his back, right? And the question at that point is, what do you do, right? Like you got to get back up. You got to try and tangle the legs. Like these guys are absolutely out there fighting for their lives, and they're trained in techniques to do so. So I think the way the fight scenes look in here with this mixture of skill and viciousness and absolute aggression too, I think it really reflects something like deep about the spirit of the age. Like it's easy to talk shit about the Middle Ages for a lot of reasons, and I myself will do so regularly, but like these guys were not like neophytes or novices. Like they knew what they were doing.
I see this stuff on film, like especially watching this or some of the other films like it, and I wonder how anyone survived a battle, let alone a guy like Jean de Carouche who survives multiple battles and is apparently very good at it. But if this is what you're saying, this is a very rehearsed violence that these guys are practicing.
They're practicing all the time. And there are late medieval combat manuals that survive. And you can see the kinds of techniques that they're learning. You can reconstruct their like whole systems of swordsmanship and fighting. some of those have a slightly different audience than Knights, but you would imagine that there were similar kind of principles, and that kind of knowledge would have been oral, if not written. Like these guys clearly are thinking about how to fight and how to do it effectively. Like it's a part of their world in the same way it is, if you're a professional fighter today and you walk into a boxing gym or a mixed martial arts gym, like it's not like you're just banging your fists against something. Like you are practicing specific technical patterns of movement and action over and over and over again, and we should expect that they were doing the same. So Jean de Carouge, as much of a dumbass as he was probably really good at that part of it. Like I spent a lot of time interviewing professional fighters earlier in my career, and like a lot of them, not especially articulate gentlemen, but were very good at what they did. And so I think that's an appealing thing about this movie, is that it presents them as being competent at the thing that they claim to have been competent at. It's just that there are much broader social consequences for their fixation on doing violence as a source of identity. So that's something I found really appealing about the movie as a whole, is like it feels right. It feels right to me as someone who has read a lot of the primary sources from this period. I've read the primary sources that are relevant to this particular case. I spent a lot of time thinking about the 100 Years' War and about chivalry and violence and knighthood, and it feels right to me. It feels like it encapsulates something essential about the period and the way that people acted and the way that they thought and their habits of mind, their kind of deep-rooted beliefs about how the world is supposed to work, to kind of put a bow on it and bring it around. I mean, I think that's what appeals to me about this movie. The fact that can be horrifying and off-putting to a modern audience says to me that the movie is working, not that there's something wrong with it.
Before I jump into the film's flaws, I do want to ask about one little thing we didn't really touch on earlier, which is when Jean de Carouge is out fighting. He's out doing all this stuff. We see his wife, Marguerite, managing the estate. Mm-hmm. Was this a common thing for
yes.
wives of nobility to do?
Yes, absolutely. They do not get most of the texts that are written in this period the vast majority of them are written by men, right? So it can be, even when we're looking at administrative texts and legal documents and court rules and kind of less intentional productions, it can still be hard for us to see women doing this stuff, but they absolutely were. And when you read between the lines or happen to be looking in the right places, there are vast numbers of noble women who are managing estates, who are not just managing them, but directing improvements, who are running law courts, who are doing all of the actual important day-to-day work of administering manors as economic units, while their husbands are out, swinging swords and doing stupid shit. Like, there are stewards, but it's usually, I think the default assumption should be that noble women were running things in their husband's absence, and often even when their husbands were there. I don't think even just when their husbands happened to be home, I don't think we should assume that women stopped running things. They're important economic actors. And that's something that's true down the social scale as well. Like peasant women are the backbone of the European economy throughout the Middle Ages, because they're doing the vast majority of the household craft work. Obviously, they're doing most of the cooking. They are, especially in this period, as we get into the later Middle Ages and the economy is a little bit more monetized, they're doing the actual work that is bringing liquid funds into the households. Right. So they're brewing ale, they're making cloth, they're doing these things. They're producing the craft products that are sold at a market to bring families into the kind of broader monetary economy of the period. But yeah, so we see her managing things. That is 100% correct. That is absolutely of a piece with the period.
All right. Earlier you had said that every film Ridley Scott had ever made had flaws to it before we reconsidered Alien. Perfect film.
Perfect film.
There's a few in the era, but where does this film err?
Too long. I think there are probably too many scenes. I think it's probably there were more efficient and effective ways of using that three perspective structure where like you didn't there were scenes that we saw from multiple perspectives that we didn't necessarily need to see from multiple perspectives. There were individual scenes that we probably didn't need. I think it probably just needed a little firmer hand in the editing room. I think it probably could have been 20 minutes shorter, and if it had, it would have. I think it really would have sung. I think a lot of the things that critics and audiences didn't like about it could have been avoided. I think some of the fighting after a certain point gets repetitive. As much of a fan of medieval combat as I am, it got repetitive after a while, and it was hard to tell who was doing what. Like, I think less violence leading up to the duel at the end would have made that hit harder. You know what I mean? Like, if what we're seeing before that are flashes as opposed to long extended battle scenes, then the absolute viciousness at the end, I think would have worked a little better. That's kind of my sense. But those are structural film, or those are flaws with it as a movie, and not as a perspective on history. Whereas, you know, like Kingdom of Heaven is entirely a product of the post 9/11 era, right? It's allegory. That's all it is. It is straight up allegory. Gladiator is a sword and sandals epic that is very much a product of kind of like late 90s ideals of democracy and freedom that were not operative at all in the period in which the film is set, right? So I consider those to be much more serious flaws with kind of the whole like framework of the movie, the whole viewpoint that it's trying to bring to us. Whereas The Last Duel just did some things that, like, you know, another director probably would have fixed in post-production, which seems like a less serious flaw from my point of view.
I remember talking, and I want to say I was talking to Matthew Gabriel about this one time, and he said one of the things that drove him nuts, and I think it was Matt that said this, was the choice of color palette in medieval films. And I kept thinking about the shades of gray of this movie. Did that bother you at all?
It wouldn't have bothered me. It did bother me a little bit. It wouldn't have bothered me quite as much because there are points in the film where the color is really striking, right? So whenever we're dealing with Pierre, his coloration and the clothes that he's wearing and his blondness, which I know people had thoughts on, that these were these are hallmarks of those scenes, and we are supposed to see the contrast between him as a character and Legree when he's in that world, and Jean de Carouge. So like I get what they're doing, but yeah, there should have been more color. Like the Middle Ages were not a colorless period of time. It wasn't just like dirt and gray shit everywhere. Like people like dye, like textile dyeing was one of the most lucrative and large scale industries of the period.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the things that actually Kingdom of Heaven actually gets well, is that there were colors. The skies were blue.
Much more
the sun
world.
came out.
Yeah.
So whenever I see these films that are in gray or like blue, the Alexander Skarsgård film that remade Hamlet.
The Northman.
The Northman, right? Kind of drove me nuts, right?
Yeah.
This film didn't do well at the box office, though. It apparently has done much better on video on demand, and people have watched it since then. Why do you think that is?
It's neither fish nor fowl. I think the things that I like about it are not things that necessarily appeal to a broad audience. Like the benefits of Kingdom of Heaven and Gladiator, like these blockbuster historical epics, is that they're visually striking. They tell pretty straightforward stories. You know, like they're not complicated in the story, in the basic narrative structure that they're using. Their themes are really clear and resonated really well with the period, with the present day. This is by virtue of being a much more complicated movie, and frankly, one that I think makes much more interesting points about perspective and sexual violence and gender relations and what makes every individual era its own. I think it's a much better movie viewed on those terms, but it's also one that isn't as easy a sell. So like if you're trying to market this movie, right? Like you're sitting in the marketing department at the production company and you're trying to figure out what to do with it. Okay, well you can do the violence, right? Like that's easy. Okay, so we got a shitload of violence. We got big name actors, but what kind of story are you telling? Like how do you make the promo material match up? How do you sell a story that's fundamentally about sexual assault? I think those are those are tough lifts given the way that movies are usually marketed, and especially historical epics are marketed. Like this is a much more intimate movie than any of Ridley Scott's other historical epics. Like it's much more focused on the basic dynamics of human relationships and the wrongs that people do to one another on an individual scale and not a society wide scale. That's just harder. Again, as I said, from my perspective, it's what makes it better. But I don't think Ridley Scott helped things by bitching about audiences not knowing what they wanted.
A great way to grade yourself to the audience is to make fun of them and belittle them for being stupid.
Exactly. Yeah, that generally tends to work pretty well. It makes me really curious to see the Napoleon movie that's coming out. I'm really, really curious to see, like, what did Ridley Scott learn some lessons from the last Duel, or is he just going to go out there and make another movie that is very much of the time in which it's set, and hope that people go along with it? I don't know. I'm really curious.
Yeah, I'm seeing the Napoleon film, and I gotta tell you, I wonder if there's a certain level of burnout because people can only do so many big blockbusters. You know, Gladiator, when it came out, was really the first in a long time that we'd seen of the sword and sandals kind of stuff, right? I mean, it was like, and of course, Russell Crowe was his absolute apex. And you're absolutely right, right? Straightforward film. Here's the hero. Here's Joaquin Phoenix, who is definitely delivered an awesome bad guy, right? And it's much easier to understand than this very nuanced film that we're seeing here. We're talking about the Middle Ages, and I can't help but look at the job market right now. I talk to my other friends who are scholars, and there's just nothing out there right now for medieval scholars. Yet, I can't help but think that this is still an important era for understand. So I'm kind of wondering if you could make your case for the Middle Ages and why we need to understand it now. You've written a book on it now. You're on to, and even more importantly, talking on a podcast about it. Why do we need to understand the Middle Ages? Like, why is it important some 1,000 years later to talk about this era?
I want to give you a reasonable answer.
Okay.
I mean, but I think that the Middle Ages are a really useful time for us to think with when we're trying to understand our modern era. I don't think the Middle Ages are any less useful for trying to understand ourselves and our world than the Roman Empire, which is probably a much more popular topic, or a much more popular point of reference.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Not as often as these people seem to, apparently. Despite having been a Roman historian.
Right.
I think we tend to go looking for historical parallels that flatter us, or in some way. And the Roman Empire, for all of its achievements, shall we say, it's easy to make it flattering. It's easy to cut out the parts of the Roman Empire that aren't like our world. Like we overemphasize when we make those comparisons. And this is true when we think back to the Civil War era or World War II. We overemphasize the things that are like our world. That make us feel good about it, that make us feel connected to that past. And we underemphasize the facets that are dramatically different, right? We don't talk about when in popular depictions, it's rare to think about the Roman Empire as fundamentally a slave society, right? One that is built on the labor of enslaved people, or one in which there's this deep and fundamental distinction between insiders and outsiders. And the reason why people went to gladiatorial games was to watch people who weren't like them die, right? To reinforce their own sense of who they were relative to the outside world. Those are aspects of the Roman world that we're maybe not talking about quite as much. The interesting thing about the Middle Ages is that the contrasts are what people dwell on. People dwell on the otherness of the Middle Ages, and have done, for 600 years. The whole concept of the Middle Ages is rooted in the idea of it being other, and less and worse. So we've never really escaped that. The flip side to it is that means that there's a ton of productive room for thinking about the parallels between the medieval world and our own. Right. These are eras in which disease, climatic change, and the emergence of ever more financialized governments and banking institutions are changing the way in which people live at every level. It's an era in which people were thinking hard about what wealth meant and how people were supposed to use wealth. Like, there's a lot of really productive late medieval thinking on wealth and sin and the obligations that the wealthy owe to their fellows. Right. Like, that's just one example, but like medieval people thought a lot about this. Right. Like, and there are useful ways of understanding how you can both accumulate wealth and do good in your society. Like those are things that medieval people thought about, that we should, it would behoove us to think a little bit about why they thought those things. It's one example, but there's a lot of really interesting thinking in the Middle Ages about violence. There's a lot of really interesting thinking about the relationship between what leaders owe their people. Right, like the late Middle Ages are the golden age of peasant rebellions. This like, people were doing a lot of really hard thinking about difficult topics, everything from authority to wealth to what faith is and who you're supposed to listen to on matters of faith. Like, it's a really stimulating period when you dig past the otherness, and then when you have the parallels in mind, you can return to the otherness, I think, in really productive ways, like you can do in this film. It's not mined nearly enough for these things. Like, the Roman Empire gets mined to death. The Civil War era gets mined to death. World War II gets mined to death for parallels. And you've got this whole incredible, pretty well documented by historical standards era that people just aren't thinking about at all, because they think it's, there's the Middle Ages. They weren't like us. Like, it's it's Marcellus Wallace in Pulp Fiction saying he's going to get medieval on your ass. There's a whole kind of veil that separates us from this era that we really should think about more.
All right, I want to ask you about your own work and books in the medieval era. Are there works that like really influenced your stuff? What should we be reading if we want to learn medieval history? What should we read?
This is probably not going to be a popular pick among medieval historians.
Oh, good.
But I love Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror. So it's a story of the 14th century as an era. Like, a lot of the scholarship in it is outdated, but in terms of taking you into the fabric of a long forgotten world, I think it's just outstanding. I think it does about as good a job as you could ever hope for. I love Dan Jones's book on the Wars of the Roses. I think that's a fantastic and incredibly readable, pretty brief political history of like how you can do a good popular history that is rooted in the scholarship while still telling a series of really compelling stories about individual people. I think it does a great job of that. Dan's a great dude. I know how hard he works to make that stuff work. So I think that's one that's really worth reading. My favorite one I love Roger Crowley's City of Fortune on Venice. I think that's another really outstanding popular history about a corner of the medieval world that is just as medieval as a noble dominated countryside, but doesn't get talked about nearly as much. Those would be my three. Those are my three favorites.
What about films? What do you like?
I like this one. I like The Last Duel. I have a real soft spot for the Russell Crowe Robin Hood movie. I really, I
go on. I'm gonna have to come back on and defend that one. We just did Prince of Thieves.
I'm not defending
Okay.
it. I'm saying I have a soft spot for it,
right.
which is not quite the same thing.
All right.
I think I think it's fun. I think it's fun in a way that these movies often are not. And I don't think it takes itself nearly as seriously as people expected it to, and that was kind of jarring. And so I don't think it was fairly evaluated. It's not a great movie, but it's one that I really enjoyed. I love the Braveheart soundtrack. I love Braveheart as a movie. I fucking hate it as anything having to do with actual history. That one's tough. Favorite medieval movie, Black Death with Sean Bean and Carice Van Houten and Eddie Redmayne. It came out like 10, 12 years ago, maybe.
Really?
Yeah. It's about a group of soldiers and I think he's a priest, who go to this out of the way village in the middle of the Black Death that doesn't seem to be affected by the plague. And it's all about what happens when they get there and why has this village not been affected, and kind of their journey into this. It is fascinating. It was not like a big budget movie or anything like that, but I think it's one of the most interesting movies that's been made about the Middle Ages.
Wow, I'm not familiar with this one. I think I maybe have seen the title card for it or something like that. Images of it on the Sean Bean, and Carice Van Houten. I mean, both of them being in Game of Thrones. This would have been predating that, I guess.
Right around then, right around that period. I can't remember exactly when it was. I think I saw it shortly after it came out, but I was smoking a lot of reefer at the time, and my memory from that period is a little hazy. But it's an outstanding movie. I've seen it a couple of times, and it's another one where I think they probably didn't know quite what to do with it. Mm-hmm. Where it's this very intimate, psychological movie that's very rooted in a particular time that is not the present day. And it's not really an action movie. It's very medieval in the way that people act and behave and think. And so I think there's a lot to like about it. But that's a kind of an out of the way pick. If you want one of those.
All right. Let me ask you the most obvious question that we're going to come back to. Our big final thing here is the last Duel a history film?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it really fundamentally is, to its detriment as a movie. I think it's a really, to its detriment as a movie and a commercial product. I think it is a history film. I think it really fits that. I think it really tries hard to reflect the period in which it's set. I think the conflicts and dynamics of the movie are deeply rooted in that period. And that, to me, fits the fundamental definition of a history movie.
Awesome, man. Hey, where can people find you beyond the realm of this podcast?
You can find me on Twitter at Patrick_Wyman, where I am spending increasingly less time. You can find me on Instagram at Wyman_Patrick. I think I'm also on Blue Sky and Threads, and if you search my name, you'll find me there. Tides of History comes out every week, mixture of scripted episodes and interviews. Pursuit of Dadliness, I'm wrapping up kind of the first block of interviews that I'm doing. I'm going to take a little hiatus, but it will be coming back as well. And dude, thank you for having me. This was just delightful to talk about all of this. I've had the time of my life.
You could not have had the time of your life. We did Dirty Dancing a few weeks ago.
Good call. Good call.
I'm going to get some guys together. We're all going to watch La La Land at some point in time and do a live.
Hell yeah.
And just cry at the end. But yeah, dude, I'm so happy that you came on. I've been wanting to get you on the pod for the longest time. So this was a blast.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I hope we get to do it again soon.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Patrick Wyman, who is just awesome today. You can find him all over social media. And you can find our intrepid producer, Fletcher Powell, at Fletcher_Powell on Twitter, Blue Sky, and other places. Thank you, of course, to you guys for being here, being part of this story, for sharing this, for liking this, for providing all this feedback. Can't tell you how much it means to me. So thank you so much for being here. We've got a slew of other podcasts coming up for you as well. So if you have films that you want to see, you have historians you want to have on this podcast, let me know and we'll get them on here. But for now, ciao for now. Bye.